Maid. An oddly familiar-sounding voice was booming through her speakers as a face started to appear through the static. Desicadianen. Semper Tide. Getting white and white to the belf. Cancelled you. Taran. The voice trailed off as the face came into focus. Sarah and Nick's eyes locked through the camera feeds while a torrent of emotions flooded both of their faces. A pair of green eyes locked with a pair of hazel eyes, one of which had a metallic sheen. Sarah's already panicking mind began to race even faster out of the billions of people in the Martian-aligned regional sovereignties. Why did it have to him? She thought to herself. The last time Sarah saw Mick was almost 4 years ago. And more importantly, with the amount of blood she saw splattered against the wall and floor as she was pulled through the breach by the extraction team, she thought she would never see his face again. His left arm had been turned to a chunky mist. Left orbital sock torn out by a piece of shrapnel, and close to a liter of blood had been sprayed across the room. That horrifying sight was the last thing Sarah saw as the team forcefully exfiltrated her from the remote weapons testing facility on Mars. And yet, here he was, with expression quickly changing from one of confused shock to one of excited amusement. Well, 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 if it ain't spooky Sarah. What in the tarn hell you doing all the way out here? Trying to blow me up again. As he spoke, he was slowly allowing laughter to slip between his words. The deep, redneck drawl of his voice was laid on so thick that it made his suddenly playful tone seem genuine. Oh, what? The last word was a shout. Looking and feeling as if she had just seen a ghost, Sarah could barely stammer out a reply, though seeing a familiar face would, in most cases, bring about a sigh of relief for someone in Sarah's current circumstance. The first thought that crossed her mind was, maybe drifting off into space would actually be better than whatever the hell this is. Wow. Sarah couldn't bring herself to say anything in response to Mick's attempt at trying to make a joke. The reality of the situation was barely able to set in, as she was flooded with memories of the past. Mick was barely containing his laughter as he started reaching slightly out of view of the communicator's camera. Through his childish giggles, Sarah could hear him pushing a few buttons on a console. Not knowing what was happening, she let her training override her mental shock. Forcing herself to snap out of her daze, she blurted out the obvious question. So, are you just going to leave me to drift? Or are you going to let me dock up so I won't die out here? Her Highland Scottish accent shook slightly with the weight of the situation. The scorned and scarred former lover seemed to not to be homicidally angry at the moment. She considered playing up her accent, that he had seemed rather fond of might keep him in a cooperative mood. The noise quickly escaped from Mick's lips as he leaned back into view of the camera and shot Sarah an "I can't believe you just asked me that" look. The obviously overblown redneck accent calmed quite a bit into something far more neutral. I'm not letting that uneasy shitkin anywhere near my dock. Leaning back out of frame, he continued, Nah, I'm gonna send out a drone to pick you up and bring you to the airlock. Don't bring nothing with you. Just your void suit. Don't bother with Eva gear. I don't fucking trust you, and I'm still not over the eye or arm or broken heart. He paused for a moment before saying that last part, letting his synthetic eye look straight through the camera and into Sarah's soul. Don't push your luck. You know these suits only have about 10 minutes of air in them without the EVA gear, right? Sarah replied hesitantly. Please tell me your drones and airlock are fast enough. Please tell me your drones are fast enough. The mocking tone was clear. Yes, my drones are fast enough. You'll be fine. I just want to time this right and get you on board as quick as I can. I'm already all set up for my test run and I ain't about to miss my window. If I gotta spend another goddamn 3 weeks repositioning all my sensor buoys, I'll be pissed. There was a slight pause as Mick seemed to stare at something off screen for a moment, then glanced back. I'll tell you what you need to know when you get here. The drone is already on its way, so look out for its lights. The second it gets there, you punch out, and it'll bring you to the airlock. I'll see you when I see you. With a wink of the synthetic eye and the wave of a hand that shouldn't be there, the line was dead. Quickly, Sarah's mind began to rush through any and every plan and backup plan she had in her mental inventory. There had to be some way to salvage this mess, otherwise her command would probably think she turned. Maybe she could conceal a weapon and overpower him? A logic plague to take over the ship AI on a concealed drive. Something? Anything? Yes. Or no. Everything that came to mind would be detected, and, at best, he would just leave her locked in the airlock till they arrived back at a Marsgov station. At worst, he could. Sarah didn't bother to linger on those thoughts. However, a strange feeling in her gut told her that she couldn't live with herself if she betrayed Mick again, especially if he didn't just leave her to drift after everything that had happened between them. From what she could see on the screen, he almost seemed glad to see her. If she were in his shoes, things would be much different. Out of the corner of her eye, Sarah saw a light through the transitter's windows that brought her back to reality. At this point, she decided the mission was over, and the only thing she could do was stay alive, whether she liked it or not. The man she had tricked into falling in love with her, used for information and espionage, and then ultimately betrayed, was her only chance at mercy. She just had to trust that Mick was actually going to save her. Trust that he wasn't planning on doing anything to her in revenge for what she did to him. Trust that he was a better person than she was, regardless of any trust issues. If she didn't do what he said, then she knew her chances of survival were essentially zero. All she could do was hope and pray that she would make it home to see the clouds over Scotland again. Within a few moments, the distant, flickering lights had fully come into view, signaling that the drone had arrived. With a deep breath, Sarah put her void suit in exposure mode, double-checked the seals on her helmet, and said a final prayer. Not even a second after, Sarah hit the emergency escape hatch and was sucked out into the vacuum of space. The drone had safely, though not too gently, collected her in its manipulator arms and was rushing her to the airlock of the S. The relative distance and speed between her and Mick's station really weren't all that far off now. Despite this, the drone was accelerating at quite a clip. As the self-sustaining spin-gravity station from her mission brief began to come into view, blackness of space and vibrant hues of Jupiter, she was at a loss for words. The brief Sarah had been given had woefully underestimated the degree of customization done to this station. In fact, from this angle, it could hardly even be called a station anymore. It was a full-on ship. Throughout the past 150 years of large-scale production, nearly every single space habitat built in the solar system had two primary features: artificial spin gravity, which varying between 4 and 10 meters per second squared, and a dedicated aquaponic segment to provide a whole system life support unit for the crew. All. They all also lacked one very specific feature: an independent and dedicated main propulsion system. Every station did have advanced reaction control systems, which were powerful enough to help maintain simple orbits. However, for anything more than just maintaining an orbit, it just was simply more efficient to use tugs. Where stations were stationary, void transitor modules and transmedian shuttles provided transit between stations, colonies, and Earth. Such ships always lacked any sort of spin gravity systems, and all life support systems were artificial. Purpose-built transitors would be used to move the stations from where they were assembled to the location where they would be commissioned. It simply didn't make sense to build a station with an engine if that engine would only be used once a decade, if it was even used a second time. Because of this, no station could truly be said to have a bow or stern, since such a concept could hardly apply to a symmetrical cylinder or a series of near-identical ring segments connected along a central shaft. Just as Sarah and the drone got close enough to distinguish a thruster array of 3 larger and 6 small bell housings surrounding a central hole of some sort, the drone quickly rotated around and began a rather harsh deceleration burn. Turning her head around to take in the rest of this strange vessel, she could barely recognize any standard of the modules on this side of the station. Those bell housing appeared to be connected to a surprisingly large stellarator reactor core through a series of seemingly ramshackle tubing. The cobbled together nature of this section of the station became more and more apparent as Sarah's gaze moved on to what could only be described as a nearly 40-meter wide bundle of wires, tubes, hoses, and containment units. Next in line was a hell forge. Why are ya out here trying to make metallic hydrogen? Yeah. Fucking lunatic. Sarah screamed out without even thinking about it. Metallic hydrogen was the same stuff Mick had tried to use as propellant in his light mass gun. It was beyond dangerous and incredibly unstable when not confined. Piercing the near-utter silence of the void, Sarah swore she could hear what sounded like a faint yet deep chuckle come through the comms in her helmet. Before she could respond, however, her eyes fell on to the next section of this ship. Though Sarah knew what a hellforge was after spending so much time around Mick and hearing him babble on and on about them, she had no idea what this next segment was. It looked like 2 large, but not quite as large as the first, stellarators were positioned on either side of some kind of array. The design of the array was so alien to her that she was having trouble even guessing as to what it was for. What was clear was that it needed an absolutely insane amount of power if it required 2 dedicated stellarators. At this point, she was actually getting kind of scared about what kind of suicidal redneck science experiment Mick had thought up this time. When her eyes were finally able to pull themselves away from the near eldritch concoction of engineering, she was almost relieved to see the rest of the modules looked relatively standard. Most definitely modified in strange ways, but still standard, though the backbone of this station would normally utilize a cylinder-style system for habitation. Near the front of the station sat a few ring segments connected by some tubes every so many meters. None of the rings, however, were spinning. Seeing a spin station not spinning was usually cause for concern, unless that station was about to be repositioned. Remembering how large the engines were and what seemed to be powering them, it was probably a good idea to not have the station spinning if Mick was planning on moving it. A sudden deceleration and re-acceleration sent Sarah towards an almost standard-looking docking and airlock module. The jarring motion was enough to disorient her for a moment before she could see what she was moving towards. She was now staring at a transmedian shuttle, docked and clamped onto the front docking station, with its pointed nose forward and giving the impression of a bridge, though it was relatively small compared to the rest of the station, likely only able to hold a dozen passengers, including 4 in the cockpit area. It completed the aesthetic and turned this station into an actual ship. At the bow was a bridge, and at the stern, nearly 600 meters away, was a massive engine. Blazoned on the side of the shuttle was a caricature of a raccoon in a bikini chugging a bottle. Chugging a bottle with 3 X's on the side. Not only was it the largest ship she had ever seen, it already had art and a name. Just as quickly as the drone had rounded the corner towards the airlock and bridge, it decelerated again as it released Sarah from its grasp with a light shove. Before she could even comment on how much of an asshole Mick was for programming the drone to ragdoll her like this, she was bracing herself for impact. There were still a few meters between her and the airlock, but she covered that distance in roughly a second. Flying through the already open airlock hatch, she impacted the surprisingly well-cushioned inner airlock door and let out a soft oof sound. She had been trained on how to reduce impact forces, and the door was well padded. But the sudden stop almost knocked the wind out of her. And considering how little wind there was left in the suit, that could have been very bad. However, as she looked back, the airlock was already almost closed. The Gardens of Deathworlders, Part 217, 18, 19, 20. An almost sing-songy voice called out each step. The voice called with exertion as the spade of the digging tool dug swiftly cut through the loose soil, as the dense polymer of the moccasin sole slammed into it. With a quick tilting motion, the spade revealed a small hole in which fell a thin metal tube with a flashing light on the end cap. Just as quick as it entered, the spade left the soil, and the boot which forced it in now pushed the soil back down. Not that it would really matter how the soil looked, or if the obviously out-of-place amount of dirt was noticed. The enemy wouldn't care. "Please, don't pop yet," the man muttered under his breath as he stepped on the small mound and continued on his way. As the lanky man, robed in a thick mixture of leathers, cloth, and metal plates, continued with his task of placing a grid of remote detonated thermobaric charges into the ground, he couldn't help but marvel at the serene beauty around him. The seemingly never-ending hills of purple grass, interspersed with massive ferns and mushrooms-like trees which, in some ways, reminded him of his home planet. Home planet, but not home world. The concept of home was different for his people than many other species in the galaxy. A home world was the planet a species evolved on, while their home planet or home station referred to body they were born on. It had been 60 generations since this man's people were stolen from their actual home, forbidden from returning for fear of cultural and technological contamination, and forced to integrate into a mostly uncaring galaxy. Of the few who seemed to care, it was obvious that many simply viewed his people as little more than potentially useful. Most of the offers of aid only served as speculative investments in these desperate people's future, in order to secure profit or personal gain. The galaxy categorized those scared, innocent people as the Deathworlders of Deathworld. They said those people had evolved on a world so hostile that even other Deathworlders would have feared setting foot on it. Some believed that it was the gifts bestowed by that deadly world. The world those alive today have only viewed through long-range sensor feeds, which made us so valuable to these Gebdi. These aliens